Imagine you're a young person embarking on a business career, and you were told that you could learn only from about half the valuable lessons out there in the world. I'm sure you're all shaking your heads in unison with the thought, well, that's ridiculous. Who would ever make that restriction? And what good student would ever agree to this? Well, as it turns out, this situation has been repeated, at least implicitly, over many years, especially in the field of entrepreneurship, as it has been traditionally been taught at business schools. Today's guests, Lindsay Hyde and Tom Eisenmann from Harvard Business School, have been co-teaching an MBA elective course that aims to fix this suboptimal situation by focusing some serious attention on this simple but not often heard question: what can we learn from the experiences of failure in entrepreneurship? In this episode of How I Teach, we'll be exploring below the surface of this largely untapped vein of entrepreneurship studies with two very able and engaging guides. Tom Eisenmann is Howard Stevenson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Lindsay Hyde is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School in the Entrepreneurial Management Unit, as well as Entrepreneur in Residence at Modern Ventures, a $200 million venture capital fund. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to really thank you for your time and sharing your insights about teaching entrepreneurial failure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very important topic. You know, in prepping for this discussion, I remember one of the first introductions to entrepreneurship I had when I worked a little bit on a case about term sheets called Web Tracker. And, you know, its main focus was a spreadsheet and, you know, figuring out all this kind of stuff. And then, you know, when I looked at your course, you know, about entrepreneurial failure, it's so much about human behavior, you know, and decision bias and all these really strong and difficult emotions related to challenges faced by entrepreneurs. So I hadn't heard about that very much, that side. Why do you think, you know, me as an outsider, a non-expert in entrepreneurship, why hadn't I heard about this storm and stress of entrepreneurship?
I'll start there. I know Lindsay will have a lot to share. We actually had a few students. We get feedback, of course, at the end of the semester, and a few said, "Boy, they were really surprised that we didn't spend more time tearing apart the financial analysis. We're looking at struggling and failed startups. Surely the truth must be in those numbers somewhere. Why didn't we spend more time interrogating the income statement and balance sheet and the operating performance and so forth?" And my response, they're right, of course. I mean, that is important, but they get so much of that in so many other courses at Harvard Business School, and the human side. I mean, at the core, good performance or bad performance with the numbers is smart decisions or poor decisions or just bad luck, and all of that maps back onto people making difficult decisions under uncertainty. That's where we're at.
I would just add to that from an entrepreneur's perspective. You know, when you get a group of founders together and the question is, oh, you know, how's it going? What everybody says is, oh, crushing it. I'm just crushing it. And that narrative of it's always going up and to the right is so much a part of entrepreneurship. And I think that really speaks to why people haven't heard a lot about failure, is because you're always crushing it until very suddenly you're not. And then people are surprised by the fact that things have gone sideways and that the business is not doing as well as they thought it was. But that public persona of a founder is such an important part of being able to raise money and recruit a team, that being vulnerable about things not going well is a real challenge.
You both are here because you're co-teaching this course on entrepreneurial failure. How did this collaboration begin?
Well, Lindsay is a failed founder, and I wrote a case on her startup that failed, and she's like so many of our case protagonists, has been a class guest over the years, and a dazzling one. And in the most recent outing, I happen to know her background enough to know that she was working as an entrepreneur in residence for a venture capital firm, but that didn't feel like a full throttle, full time gig. So I sensed that she might have just enough bandwidth to come and join. And I knew from interactions I'd had with her, with the students, that she would be fantastic at case method instruction. So I literally pitched her during the middle of a class in front of all the students, and she pretty much accepted. And we then had to sell it to the dean's office, but that worked beautifully, and here we are.
Oh, how did that pitch go, Lindsay?
It was amazing, right? So, as a failed founder, when Tom first approached me about the course, my immediate response was, I would love to have a case written about Baru because I wish I had had this course when I was at HBS, right? This would have saved me so much pain and heartache. And so then the opportunity to work with Tom and to actually bring this to the MBA students, it was just an opportunity that was too good to pass.
Now that you've taught a little together, what are the advantages and disadvantages of team teaching? And because this might be instructive for people thinking about this kind of course
Yeah,
for their own
yeah. I
schools.
assume how I teach is your audience is educators
Exactly.
all over the world. So this is I've co-created 14 courses at Harvard Business School, and I added it up. 12 of them have been I've been a co-instructor, either created or co-taught with a colleague. I love it. And it's, by the way, not unusual at HBS, especially in the entrepreneurship courses. We love to pair a scholar with a practitioner because you
Mm.
get the rigor and the sort of linkages to theory from the scholar, and you get the practical relevance and deep understanding of the real world phenomenon from the practitioner. So we've done it over and over again. I find that it makes for much sharper teaching plans, right? When two smart people come at the material. Lindsay and I spent an hour and a half this morning working on the teaching plan for our first class session. And it's very different than where she started, and what she started with was much better than what I could have come up with on my own. So um, it's it's good for the teaching plan. It's great for the students too. They see the different interpretations in real time, and they love the variety. Frankly, I mean,
Mm.
every instructor is going to have a different style, and especially we teach in the second half of the second year, and our students are craving novelty. So having two humans up in front of them with very different styles is something they love.
Let's start with the beginning. Why is this topic, entrepreneurial failure, important for students to explore?
Like I said, from my experience as an HBS student, I so wish that I had had this opportunity to take a look at what are the common patterns of failure and to really think about how to avoid them. And then for any entrepreneur, the likelihood that your startup is going to fail is very high. And so it is an equally important question to think about how is it that you fail well? What does that entail? And how do you personally and professionally come back from that failure?
Hmm.
Because it is crushing. So much of your personal identity is tied up in this business. And really being able to have an action plan, which is the second half of the course with the students, I think is going to save a lot of people some dark days.
Yeah, and I'd add it to that, Mark. Um, it's very, very relevant for entrepreneurs thinking about how to what are failure patterns? Can I recognize them in advance? What can I do to avoid them? And if I do fail, as Lindsay says, which is quite likely, how can I fail well? But we fail in everything we do in life, and many of the lessons that come through in the course and the examples that come through in the course are, if you're working in a big company and your initiative, you're in charge of an initiative that fails, it's a lot of the same pressures you're going to feel and
Mm.
tactics that you can employ. So I think this part of the course has relevance well beyond the entrepreneurial setting.
Going back to your point, Lindsay, you were talking about entrepreneurs always sort of pointing to the top right of the graph, right? So would you say that entrepreneurs self-select to say, well, I know these 3 quarters messed up, but not me? Or are they going in there saying, wow, this is really tough, I'm going to learn as much as I can before I get started, or some variation of that?
I think it would be we would do a gross disservice to the diversity of entrepreneurs to say that there is one way, right, that people approach this. But we know that there are some common patterns, and you identified some of them, right? So some entrepreneurs say, no, 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 this had nothing to do with me. This was entirely about you, employee, you, market issue, you, customer who didn't understand what I was building.
A silly
And
customer, right?
and the reality is, right, that it's always much more complicated than that. And I think that's really the beauty of the case method, is that you can tease out all the complexity that comes into a failure that is likely part the entrepreneur, it's likely part the market, it's likely part the investors. It's so many things that come together to create that moment.
Let me segue to a point by making it pitch for the case method, because one of the themes here that I've heard and read related to this course is how complex things are, right? It's not just one thing. And can you talk about why the case method is so, helpful to not, let people boil things down to one thing?
So we're wired as humans to oversimplify.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you talk to investors in particular, also a lot of entrepreneurs, but investors in particular, about why startups fail, you get a cliched um, explanation about horses and jockeys. The jockey being the entrepreneur, the horse being the concept.
Mm.
And there's an endless debate about whether success and failure is due more to the quality of the jockey or the quality of the horse. And um, most investors, by the way, would say it's the jockey, but it is indeed a real oversimplification. And so the case method, we in our first class session, we're going to do a poll, and we're going to ask a bunch of potential explanations for why the company in question is struggling. And I promise you, and we'll ask the students, is this a big contributor? Sort of, it's there, but it's not the needle mover, or nothing, no impact at all. And we know this from experience. We've done it with other cases. All of the explanations are going to get a lot of, this is decisive. This one's decisive. This one's decisive. And when students see that, um, they can see that oversimplifying, looking for one root cause or one simple explanation for why a company's in trouble, isn't the way to go. That it's complicated, and the factors will reinforce each other in some cases. But you need the nuance and the time of the case method to explore. Now, yes, it's a flawed business model, but there are problems with leadership, and there is more competition than we ever anticipated. And the investors are pushing the entrepreneur in the wrong direction. And at some point, it's just a simple accumulation of a lot of ands that sort of pushes the company into trouble. Sometimes it's even more complicated than that.
The other thing I would just add about what the case method does so well is it really pushes the students to sit in the seat of the entrepreneur. So to ask the question, here's the information that you have, what would you do? And I think that need to really think through, how would I approach these decisions given all the things that are true about startups? We have limited information, we have limited resources, we have limited time. Gives students an understanding of just how difficult and tricky it is to go from an idea on paper to actually bringing something into the world.
You started to answer my next question, which is how do you introduce this topic? So you're going to, introduce it with a poll, get these varying, takes on what was happening or what was the matter. Anything else about your first course, the sort of, menu or the table you're laying out for students for the rest
The
of
first session.
Yeah,
Mark, have you had Jim Heskett on this podcast?
I have not.
Wow. So a lot of your listeners, if they have any connection to Harvard Business School or have just used the old service management cases, will recognize the name. He's a legendary case method instructor. Had such an impact on how so many of us teach that we actually name the start of a certain kind of teaching plan the Heskett plan, the Heskett start. And what Jim would always do, every case, of course, has a trigger issue, that decision that's there in the last 20%. And Heskett would always start with the trigger. A cowardly instructor doesn't do that, right? What a structured teaching plan looks like is, you explore the business, and only after we really understand the business can we tackle this hard decision that the manager or the entrepreneur is facing.
Mhm.
Heskett would do just the opposite. He'd take them straight to the decision, and it pumps an enormous amount of energy into the room, which is great. But usually, if it's an interesting decision, like so many of our cases, reasonable people, some are going to go left, some are going to go right. And so not only do you have all this energy, but the students are now on the edge of their chair. They've leaned forward because I think left, and she just made a really powerful argument for right. So either I'm wrong or she's wrong. Like, let's keep going. And then there's this magical moment where, and this is how Jim taught us to just trust the students, where one student will, after 15 minutes, pick a time, put up their hand and say, I don't see how we can continue having this discussion until we dig deeper into how this business is making money, where the market's go. Pick the analytical
Hmm.
issue. And then the instructor goes, of course that's true. And then you segue into that, what a lot of instructors would use as the first module becomes the second module with a Heskett start.
Mm.
And that's what we're going to do with our first case.
Oh, great. So you get a lot of passion going, lots of disagreements and maybe confusion too, right?
Especially important, Mark, on day one. I think a lot of your listeners will recognize this. Our students are stone cold quiet on day one. Some of them are not prepared, unfortunately. But even those who are, they're kind of concerned about, they're checking each other out, and they're concerned about the impression they're making on each other. And they're a little worried about seeming too overeager, because that's not always a cool thing to be. So you can get dead silence for the first 10 minutes.
Mm.
So it helps to come in with a question that's going to rile them up.
We're going to have a whole podcast on Jim Heskett then. I think. Well, let's get to a few of the nitty gritties of the course then. Could you talk about, in as much or as little detail as you would like, the structure of the course, sort of the beginning, middle, end, how you see the arc of what people are learning throughout?
So the beginning of the course is really structured around looking at what are the patterns of failure that Tom's identified in his research. And we divide those into patterns that we typically see in really early stage companies and then patterns that we see in later stage companies.
Okay.
Then the second half of the course is actually new for us this year. And this is where we're looking at this question of how is it that entrepreneurs fail well? And how do they rebound? Maybe most importantly, what is it that are all of the different tactical requirements, as well as what are the social, emotional, and personal network requirements that enable people to go from I've failed this one time, I'm never starting a company again, to becoming a really seasoned serial founder who can take all of that learning that comes from failure and apply it to their next startup.
One thing I do like about the pedagogical style at HBS is, in general, this constant questioning of one's own, last course that you just taught, and adding this new part now that you're doing. It's the same thing with doing cases. They have revisions. No, we're going to revise it. It's it's better than last year. So what's been your biggest aha moment when you said, "Oh, I need to change something," or I'm taking the wrong track in this course? What should I do now to make it better?
So, Mark, for me, this goes back to the genesis of the course itself. For years, there's a required first year course at HBS that all MBAs take called the Entrepreneurial Manager. It's case-based. And I taught that course a few times, and the feedback we'd get from students ran along. I mean, there's a lot of feedback on different points, but a thing we would always hear was, hey, you told us along the way here that 2/3 of startups fail, and yet every single case we saw in this course was a brilliant success. So what gives? And is there nothing we can learn from failure? And so I took that to heart and tried to pull a couple of failed startups into that course, cases on failed startups, and they bombed.
Mm.
And the reaction of students, I wrote them up as a full failure story. The reaction of students was, well, that's kind of obvious why that failed. It's all here in the case. They did this wrong. They did this wrong. They did this wrong.
Uh-huh.
So, seems like the founder might have been an idiot, or worse than unlucky. And so you had to rethink how to actually teach failure. One of the things I've discovered along the way, I've always had a lot of class guests. We use class guests a lot in our entrepreneurship courses.
Mhm.
And it occurred to me somewhere along the way that having a founder sit there like a bump on the log for 60 minutes while we all discuss the case, and then they come in for the last 20 minutes, was somehow a waste of a learning opportunity.
Mhm.
So over the years, I've been pulling the protagonist, the class guest, into the discussion at intervals. It's a tricky thing to do because some of them will take over the discussion. Students love nothing better than turning the discussion into a Q&A and sort of getting away, and so you do have to manage that process. But what I realized was I could neutralize this rear view mirror problem that our students have with the failure cases by bringing the failed founders into the discussion right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
So when you meet Lindsay, your reaction is kind of like, huh, she's pretty impressive. And she's got a very clear explanation for why she did what she did. And she seems to have a pretty deep understanding of what she might have done differently. So it takes away the boy, this is easy. They look at this person, they're impressed by the people are great role models. And it livens. By the way, it also livens the class up a lot to sort of bring the protagonist in at intervals. That was the biggest aha, I think, is that it's good that the failed founder can actually be the right way to teach entrepreneurial failure. Pulling them into the discussion right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, having come in as a class guest a number of times and seen students experience that moment of walking side by side with the founder through the failure, you can see their body language start to get really uncomfortable. And then their faces start to go a little gray. And they start to realize just how hard it gets to be toward the end of the life of a business. And I think that having that emotional connection to somebody also helps to prevent that rearview mirror problem of, oh, this must have been really easy. They can start to see how the emotion takes over and what that swirl looks like. And then the other thing that's really important is they have a real live human being standing in front of them who seems reasonably happy with where their life has gone. And so it helps them also to see that you can go through this. It's really hard in the moment, but you will be okay on the coming out the other side. And I think that is the magic of the course, is giving students the ability to see both sides, that it is really terrifying and really hard, but you will be okay.
You talked about patterns of failure, and I know people can look this up, the details of the patterns you've talked about. But maybe could you talk about one of them, and either how it's taught or how you get students to get their own aha moments about a certain pattern, maybe something that surprised them?
Lindsay, do you have a favorite?
I mean, my favorite is the false positive, because that's where we
Okay.
talk about Peru. So the false positive pattern is really one where an entrepreneur has done a good deal of testing, a good rigorous set of testing up front, hit upon an idea, and then seems to find product market fit with early adopters. And we saw this really strongly in Baru, where we were providing a pet service in luxury apartment buildings in downtown Boston, and just happened to hit by total chance on an apartment building that had an overpreponderance of pets in a Boston winter that had 9 feet of snow. And so the results that we got from our early adopters looked outrageously good and far, far better than what we would see subsequently. And so, I think that the giving people a flavor of what does it look like when things seem to be going well, and then how does it go so sideways after you think you've found product market fit and you're really ready to step on the gas. At the early stage, it can be such a challenging one to wrap your mind around, and so that's one that I certainly appreciate us covering.
Yeah, and what I'd add there is, Lindsay talked about how hard it is a little while ago. This one's really hard because as an entrepreneur, if you don't sync with the early adopters, you don't have a business, right? Your success as an entrepreneur hinges entirely on your ability to sell those first few customers. And so what could be more natural than embracing them, catering to their every wish, celebrating with them? And it turns out that sometimes, not always, sometimes the needs of your mainstream customers, the customers you need to build a big business, are going to be different. And an entrepreneur is under so much time pressure, that to take the time to understand the difference between the needs of the early adopters and the mainstream customers just feels like a luxury. But we see over and over again that the failure to do that can lead to a flawed product strategy, a flawed marketing strategy, and really hurt the company.
Yeah, that combination of all these unknowns that you're not sure which path to go to, plus the time compression seems like so hard.
Mark, another aha in the course. It doesn't
Mhm,
relate to the failure patterns per se, but it threads through a lot of them.
mhm,
The students come to realize that pressure from investors, particularly venture capital investors, is at the root of. I mean, I don't want to contradict myself and say there's a single cause, but boy, it's an important contributing factor in a lot of
mhm,
startup failures. And this is important because I think at a lot of business schools, Harvard Business School in particular, we lionize venture capital. You come out of HBS as an aspiring entrepreneur, you just assume you're going to go raise venture capital. And I think what the students hear a bunch of founders come in and say like, wow, I went in eyes wide open knowing that the venture capitalists are going to push for hyper growth. They're going to push me to swing for the fences, right? Because
mm,
they only make money if I'm worth 10 times or 50 times the amount of money they put in the first
mm,
place. And they have a business model that they'll make a huge return on a very small fraction of the investments they make, and so they push everybody to grow like crazy and take big risks. But there are other ways to build a business other than trying to grow like crazy and trying to take those big risks. And I think that's eye opening for a lot of our students.
mm,
To the point where I was on a call yesterday with one of them who deliberately avoided venture capital in order to bootstrap her venture.
mm. Well, I think if I recall correctly in some of your writings, choosing your investor could really make a big difference. And so there's different expectations and relationships we'll have. You agree with that, Lindsay?
I think it's really a question of alignment, to
Mm,
Tom's point, right? So it's about getting the right entrepreneur with the right capital stack matched to the right opportunity.
mm,
And if either your style of how you want to grow your business doesn't match the kind of business you're building, or the capital stack doesn't match the kind of business you're building, anything that's out of alignment in that way, one will very likely sink the business, but
mm.
two, it's going to be a miserable process for all involved as you go through it. And that's one of the things that we really highlight in the course is the importance of getting all of those things in alignment for
Mm.
yourself, for your employees, for your investors, so that everybody's expectations can be met.
I wonder if there's not a match service for VCs and entrepreneurs, right? I'm just wondering about grading in your course, and I saw that you have a final exam on your outline of your syllabus. You say that people can take a final exam alone or in pairs. That's very interesting. Um,
No, no, that's not
no,
quite right. So they have an option of either taking a traditional final, which at HBS, Harvard Business School, is a case, 4 hours, write an analysis of a case, and about a third of our students do that. Two-thirds have the option of doing a paper on
oh,
most of,
forgive me, I misread that.
and they
Okay,
can do
gotcha.
that solo or in pairs.
Mhm.
And the paper will typically be about it can either be about a failed startup, analyzing what went wrong, or a lot of them will pick a going concern and imagine a future where this thing has failed, and essentially a pre-mortem analysis. And then some folks will pick topics like, are failure patterns in biotech different, or aspects of the failure process.
Are these like research papers, or do you encourage people to interview?
Both. I
Both.
mean,
Okay.
yeah, we love it when they go off and do interviews. In the second part of the course that Lindsay was talking about, we're definitely good. It's called a field course, which definitely has a big team project component. We will require them to talk to failed founders.
One of the other things that students did with their papers was a pre-mortem on their own startups. So looking at startups they were considering founding and going through and identifying the potential failure patterns that they might have a propensity to encounter and
Oh.
how they planned to avoid those. And I think that that gave several students an opportunity to really reflect on, is this business model right? Am I the right founder for this business? Do I want to pull in this kind of capital that will be needed to help it grow? And set them off on a good path.
That seems to me like a huge lesson, right? Because I think I read that a lot of people have this bias towards action, and so they'll just do stuff without like doing a market survey or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're describing another one of our failure patterns, which we call a false start, which is because entrepreneurs want to make things happen, and because they think they can see around corners. And because particularly once you raise money, the clock is ticking. The money starts running out. All of those things lead people to tend to skip some of those important upfront steps of speaking to potential customers and doing that kind of discovery work. But to the question about grades, like almost every other Harvard Business School course, half on class participation and half on either the exam or the final project. And a forced curve, Mark.
And a forced curve, right? Okay, no, absolutely. So with failure being the central topic, I'm thinking about the end of the course, right? Did you find that people were more or less enthusiastic about entrepreneurship? What was their state of mind, or I shouldn't say state of mind? What were their emotions like as they were leaving the
Well,
course?
you heard Lindsay say their faces can go ashen at several points during the course. So, when I created the course 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this is one of the things I worried about. Will I scare off an entire generation of Harvard Business School students? Poets and Quants is the blog that writes about all things MBA. I could envision the article that says, "Hey, we see that entrepreneurship has come to a dead stop at Harvard Business School. Has something weird happened?" Um, and one of the things we do is we actually survey all the students right before the last class, the night before the last class, and ask them, has the course change the likelihood that you'll become an entrepreneur in the next 5 years? And what we see is that, in fact, 20% say, "Yep, I'm less likely. You scared the devil out of me. It's way more." I kind of knew in the abstract that it was painful, but now I know in a much more direct way. I don't think I'm ready for it. I'm surely not going to do this until I have an amazing idea, et cetera, et cetera. 40% say they are actually more likely to do it, believe it or not. And they say, "Yeah, I've looked into the abyss. I've stared it in the face. I think I can handle that." And I actually, it has actually increased my confidence to sort of see the worst it can be. And to Lindsay's point, that these very talented people have bounced back, and about half of them are entrepreneurs again. Some have become venture capitalists. Some are working in big companies, but they've all got their act together in really
Mm-hmm.
impressive ways. And the remaining 40% say it hasn't changed my view at all. But what it has is opened my eyes to making sure that I've got a good idea, and also this issue of funder fit. Making sure that you choose an investor profile that really suits the business and suits your own risk preferences as an entrepreneur.
And to Tom's earlier point, I think it's so vital for a group of really passionate, high achieving students to have an opportunity to think about failure and to really normalize the experience of failing and learning and rebounding. And so that particular piece of it, as an entrepreneur, the rallying cry is always fail fast, fail often, but no one tells you how to do that. And so giving them the tools to do that well, I think is a critical service.
That is a great point because, I know people who are super brilliant and succeed, 20s, 30s, maybe into the early 40s without a major problem. But if they hit a problem, they're not prepared. That's the biggest surprise of their lives, and this is a great service. That's, I must say. So, a couple other questions about the class before we wrap up. What have you learned from students who have taken the class? Has there been any great learnings that you've had in interactions or papers or anything from your students that was interesting?
We've only offered the course twice, so
Mm,
it's a little early.
right.
It's only a couple of years old, and I wish I could pull a rabbit out of the hat. I mean, what I'd say is I've learned a ton from our case protagonists, many of whom, by the way, are former students. So it takes, I should say, I mean, Lindsay's a good example. It takes a certain amount of ego resiliency to have somebody write about your failure, and it takes a certain amount of trust in the process. And folks who've been through the case method and know what it can do at its best, I think are going to be more likely to trust an instructor to tell their story and tell it in ways that are balanced and sort of highlight what went wrong, and mistakes that they made, but also sort of leave students understanding that this is hard, and yes, there were mistakes, but yes, there was some bad luck, and you're trying to do something new without resources. So guess what? It's going to fail a lot of the time. So no, I'm afraid. I don't know, Lindsay, if you've got anything you took away from our last batch.
For me, it's more about the classroom experience. So, as a relatively new instructor, Tom had shared with me the power of this Haskett start, and I walked into the classroom very tentatively and not truly believing that we were going to get a student to raise their hand and say, actually, we need to really think about analyzing the business. And so, for me, I've come away with just a true understanding of the power of the student's curiosity to drive the case method forward, and to help that be the way that we unpack the class together.
So now that you've taught this a couple years, and how do you see either the class changing over time, or maybe even your own approaches to entrepreneurship? After a couple years, have your priorities changed? Lindsay, if you go back and want to start another business, is there something from this that you want to take into your own future?
Yeah, there's a concept that we're exploring in the second half of the class called ABZ planning, which is comes out of the LinkedIn team and is really about planning for what is your Z plan. So if this venture fails, what happens next? And what it does is it gives you the ability to have enough time to in Tom's language, to fail well. So to make sure that your employees are all paid a severance, to make sure that your vendors are all paid and all your bills are covered, to make sure that you've wound down the business responsibly. And that doesn't always happen because
Mm,
entrepreneurs don't always understand how long it takes to wind down a business or how expensive it is. And so the rebounding piece and the failing well piece has been one of the biggest learning areas for me.
mm,
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Mark, right on that topic. We see a lot more research that we can and need to do. We're starting to get it underway. Um, an example is last spring, we got a question about are there gender patterns to who becomes a founder again after failing as a founder, and suggestion that in fact women were less likely to launch a business again having failed as an entrepreneur.
mm,
And there wasn't any good data out there on it. So we went and got the data, and it was true.
mm,
It's sort of like a 60-40, 60% of men will do it, and only 40% of women, quite a big difference. Um, and there are a lot of questions why. We have hypotheses about why that's the case, but uh, need some research. And then, of course, the natural next step after you do the research is to pull the research into the course in some way, whether through cases or other ways.
Well, I think the kinds of interesting angles you're taking to entrepreneurship points to how important it was just to ask the first question. Why exactly do these places fail? And it sounds like your future is just going to be rich with like finding new questions related to that to dig into, like this one that you just mentioned. So,
Yeah, and there are adjacencies that we're really curious about. We got close. We may not pull it off this year to exploring failure of social enterprises, socially focused ventures.
mhm,
Um, the patterns of Lindsay launched a successful social enterprise before she went to got her MBA, it's clear that the failure patterns are very, very different. For one thing, they just don't die; they kind of just live on because basically some donor, out of the goodness of their heart, will keep dribbling in just enough money to keep the thing alive. So you have a lot of too many subscale social enterprises out there. Um, but then you get domain sprawl, right? Anybody that's going to give a big block of money to a social enterprise wants to put their name on a thing. You don't want to give more money to something that somebody already put their name on. You want your name on something new, and if you aggregate enough new things, that's going to pull any organization apart just from lack of focus. So that science-based businesses have different failure patterns. Science-based ventures, and corporate ventures, right? There's a lot of entrepreneurship within big companies, and
mhm.
and the failure patterns there are radically different than what we talk about in the course. So there's no end of of looking at failure and new ventures that we can do.
Wow. Well, so maybe they'll refer to this as the Eisenmann Hyde method, of of researching failure in different companies. But really interesting. So, well, I want to thank you for your time. This has been, an hour from your day, and I know you're both extremely busy. I know that our listeners will really love getting these insights about this important topic. So, thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.